Sure. So in this context, first of all, it's important to understand that learning means the firm's ability to reduce the likelihood of a future recall. So that's what we're calling learning. And organizational learning theory would tell us that firms can learn from negative events. But prior studies of product recalls have found mixed evidence. So in some cases, firms have experiences of product recalls and the likelihood of a recall actually goes up, and in some cases it goes down. So that was a little bit of a dilemma or a paradox that we wanted to try to address. So to shed some light on that, what we're looking at is how the source of the quality failure can influence the experience of learning and then how the firms learn from the recall. So if you think about a supply chain, a firm could have a failure within their own internal processes, or a supplier to them could have a failure. They could also get some experience from an industry failure. So according to organizational learning theory, an internal failure, and this is what we call an internal locus of failure. An internal failure would be more of a direct experience, and we would expect potentially more learning to come from that than a supplier failure, which is an indirect learning experience. So we differentiate between three different types of learning experiences. So my internal processes as a firm, internal locus; supplier, that's external locus within the supply chain. And then this third idea is, do I actually learn when my competitors have a problem as well? So we test whether these experiences have a direct effect on organizational learning. We also test whether or not when the experiences occur together cumulatively, do those things interact to enhance or diminish learning. Absolutely. We study recalls in the food industry, and this is interesting in part because in the food industry, quality failures are all conformance quality failures. In other words, you don't have design failures in food. So these are all failures that are a result of some sort of manufacturing error or some sort of contaminant being introduced. And we think this is important because if you're a firm trying to improve your quality or reduce the likelihood of recalls, the processes and resources you would use to address design failures are fairly different from those that you would use to address conformance quality failures. So we collected a sample of all the firms that are publicly traded in the United States that conducted recalls in food from 2004 to 2013. That gives us a total of 518 recall announcements made by 125 different firms. And then we model the learning from the product recalls with a negative binomial estimator to predict the number of recalls in a given firm year. That model takes into account a number of different controls at the firm level, and we also look at things such as the scope of operations, the level of competition the firm has, their profitability, their size, their age, typical controls like that. To model the learning experience, we lag the number of recalls from a given source. So the count variable represents the experience, and that count variable will represent either internal locus failures, supplier external locus failures, or failures that have occurred with a competitor in the same industry. We also test for whether or not there's a complementary or substitutionary effect of these different types of experience. So again, direct experience comes from when a firm has failures in its own internal processes, and indirect experience comes either from a competitor having a failure or from a supplier failure. So we're able to include interaction terms to tell us whether or not when those kinds of experience occur together, do they diminish or enhance the learning. So what we find is that there is a main or direct effect of firms having experience with their own internal failures. They also learn from supplier failures. And when we look at the interactions between different types of experience, what we find is that as the amount of experience with internal failures and supplier failures increases, there's actually evidence of what we would call a substitutionary effect. In other words, at some point, the level of experience for both of those kinds of failures gets to a point where learning effects are diminished rather than enhanced. This might be because firms get overwhelmed with the amount of information that they need to process. There are maybe things that firms could do to try to overcome that. But one of the things that we find that's really interesting is that industry experience on its own doesn't have an effect on learning. So your competitors having failures alone doesn't affect how much you learn, your ability to reduce the likelihood of a recall. But when you have your own internal failures and industry failures, there's a complementary effect. In other words, more industry failures, more internal failures, higher rate of learning, lower rate or reduced likelihood of product recalls. And we think that might be potentially because when there are industry failures and internal failures occurring at the same time, that helps the firm pay attention a little bit more and makes the failure more salient. In other words, if I have my own failure internally, I might just chalk that up to happenstance, bad luck. But when I see these failures going on in the industry as well, I pay more attention and I look at this as a more systemic problem that I really need to address by improving my quality systems. Well, we interviewed a number of firms in the food industry as we were conducting this research, and what we heard from firms pretty unambiguously is they believe they are learning from recalls, but what our research shows is that they possibly could be learning more. So, for example, because the negative experience can be a source of learning, managers can look at ways to formally and informally encourage learning and encourage deeper learning. So in other words, potentially not just looking for a quick fix, but looking for something that is going to more systemically improve the quality systems to prevent that future failure. So we would encourage managers to think about how they can direct resources in a way that encourages that, but at the same time caution them about being overly prescriptive about how that works, because that could reduce employees' motivation and ability to innovate. We also think that we're not sure how widespread information sharing is in the food industry as far as sharing best practices around some of these types of failures. In some segments of the food industry, we've heard a lot about that kind of information sharing, but it's not clear that that's a widespread practice. It's also not clear that they really are engaging with smaller firms, which there are a lot of smaller firms in the food industry. So learning from your competitors in terms of food failure, looking for more systemic improvements, looking for things to encourage deeper learning rather than quick fixes. Those are the takeaways for organizations. So we think, first of all, that there's an opportunity for more research to go across industries. It's tough to do, but we need it because the industry context likely matters in terms of how quality failures occur, how they're addressed, and what types of learning come out of them. So we need, for example, to have studies that go across industries so that we can look at differences in how firms learn and react to conformance quality failure as compared to design quality failures. We believe that there's opportunity with this construct that we use called the supply chain locus of failure. So in our study, the supply chain locus of failure is simply internal, if it's my own internal processes that cause the failure. External, if the failure originates with a supplier. And we think that's interesting because we think there's very likely differences in how firms perform after a recall, whether the failure comes from outside their processes or inside their processes. We also think that there may be changes in firm strategy that would differ depending on whether the failures happen internally or externally. So we would like to see more research looking at this idea of the supply chain locus of failure and see where that can take us.